Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Lunatics Radio Hour podcast. Today we have a Lunatics Library episode for you, filled with time travel themed stories to go with last week's episode. I'm Abby Brinker, sitting here with Alan Kudan.
Hello.
And it's about time that we share these stories with you.
I gave her that joke. It's dumb. It's dumb as hell.
It's not dumb as hell.
It is. Let's start the stories.
Before we do, I do want to remind everybody, it's been a little while since we've mentioned this, that we have
merch.
Beautiful designs in our merch store.
We're actually doing a merch push?
Absolutely.
Why?
Because there's beautiful spring colors, new colors. Available, perfect for this time of year. If you go to lunaticsproject.com, click on merch, it will take you to our merch store. Now is the time.
I like new colors. I always wear black.
Yeah, maybe we should get you a nice light pink Lunatics hoodie.
The best accent color for your skin is whatever color your nipple is.
Is that true?
Yeah, it's how like it's a surefire way to make a lipstick look like a color that jives with your complexion. You match your nipple.
Fashion advice from Alan. Now we know. Fashion and beauty advice.
That's me.
Now we all know how to get the right lipstick shade and how to pick out our Lunatics merch. I don't quite know that we have a lot of nipple colored items in the merch store, but perhaps a few.
That's a real missed opportunity if you ask me.
Okay, well now we know for our next drop. Anyway, thank you to everyone who's already bought merch. I'm absolutely such a fan of the designs we have. We've worked with some really, really incredibly talented artists. We have more coming this year, but check it out if you haven't already, lunaticsproject.com, and click on merch at the top of the page. All right, now that the housekeeping is behind us, shall we dive in to some time travel theme stories?
Yeah, what's up first?
Our first story today I am very, very excited about. Two of our very talented friends, one, Kyle Major, who wrote this story, and Phil Eslick, who is voice acting it, are super talented. Neither of them have had, in my opinion, enough airtime on this podcast, and I hope that this will unlock more opportunities with them. But very, very, very excited about this.
Oh, we got Big Daddy Phil for this?
As he's known by his friends and family.
Dang.
Yeah, very, very excited. Okay,
Cool.
We'll talk more about Kyle and Phil after, but let's roll the tape.
Blast. Written by Kyle Major. Read by Phil Eslick.
Well, I fucked up. This was a mistake. I've become one of those fictional mad scientists, a victim of my own hubris. Except I can't blame this on hubris so much as stupidity. I thought the damn machine was unplugged. It was my job to clean it. I would have never stepped inside if I thought this was a real risk, but I visited the hospital wing where all the previous time travelers are dying their grisly deaths. I've never coveted their positions, but here I am, 80 years in the past. 1997. It's the year that popped into my head when the machine asked, when to? My grandma used to go on about the 1990s, how it was the last decade movies and rock music were any good, the time of her childhood, but also the last time any American felt hopeful about the world, pre-9/11 and pre-climate change. I'd never want to return to my own childhood, but Grandma always made her sound idyllic. I liked Bikini Kill and Pearl Jam when she played them for me. So I traveled to 1997 in Manhattan, because the machine can't travel through space. It's locked onto one longitude and latitude through the millennia, the basement of an office building in Midtown. And if you go back far enough, I guess that would be the dirt beneath a forest floor. Go back far enough and it might be underwater, or a fissure as Manhattan separates from the continent. Go forward, and maybe it's underwater again. The travelers we sent into the future returned with alarming insanity, in addition to the standard traveler's radiation poisoning. They can't communicate anything they might have learned about humanity's fate because they are distracted by voices, their attention monopolized by a psychosis that does not respond to medication. My employer's official line is that this is an effect of the forwardness itself, a directional disease rather than a sign of just how bad things are going to get for our species. But when you witness how your own future has reduced a leading scientist to a woman screaming at walls, it's tough not to feel some pessimism. The travelers we sent to the past have returned with their nobility intact, stoically facing down their deaths, models of the kind of heroic sacrifice that we all assume died out in the decades before my grandma's era, relics of the 20th century's great wars. They killed themselves for science, acting as their own lab rats. And then there's me, a janitor. So unheroic, I doubt they'll let me die in the same hospital wing as all the other guys. I wouldn't want to pollute them with my plebeian aura. The machine has popped me out onto a beautiful day in July, and Times Square is full of tourists. No police robots anywhere. I breathe a sigh of relief. The air doesn't smell overwhelmingly of weed smoke, just hot garbage, the city's once and future signature scent. The tourists themselves look more like representatives from all over the place than the tourist crowds in my day, when only the top percentiles from a few wealthy countries can afford to travel, and middle America stays home. But otherwise, it's bizarre how little has changed. I'm delighted to see exotic payphones and yellow taxis, sure, and the guides hustling folks for tour buses are humans, but there's also the same garish neon ads on every skyscraper surface, the same noisy car traffic, the same men in suits pushing through tourist throngs with irritation. All these chain restaurants and retail franchises have gone extinct by 2077, but they were replaced with brands of similar wording and graphic design, so they don't strike me as old-fashioned. The tourists snap pictures with Polaroid cameras instead of ocular implants, but still, every squirm of my guts could be the cancer blooming. And for this? At least July in 1997 is below 120 degrees, something that July in New York has not been since before I was born. I'm not sure how cool it is now as I walk down Broadway, but I guess in the low 90s, balmy February weather that makes me want to strip off my shirt and sunbathe in Bryant Park. Bryant is not one of these city parks still around in 2077, and the few parks that remain have become amenities for residents of luxury buildings. I joined dozens of others on the grass in the park, but it's not relaxing. I'm too amped up. I can't stop thinking about how soon I'm going to die. Maybe months, probably weeks. I always figured that news of my imminent demise would have an enervating effect, give me a zest for life or an impulse to climb trees, but instead it's a mental drain. All of my energy going towards the task of trying to make myself believe in it. I put my shirt back on and continue downtown. The sun is setting as I reach Greenwich Village. The crowds still contain tourists, but fewer here than in Midtown. Even displaced in time, I do not doubt my ability to discern tourists from locals. In 2077, Greenwich is one of the neighborhoods where a corporation must officially designate you as wealthy and safe before you can enter. In 1997, I spot some fancy-looking buildings and fashionable people, but the gentrification is far from complete. I pass middle-aged hippies in thrift store t-shirts and queer people clustered in groups and old freaks that haven't yet been priced out. My stomach hurts. Cancer, that you? I don't have any money, since this was an accidental trip. I'm limited in how long I can stay without being able to buy something to eat. I loiter outside the Angelica Theater for a while, excited about a real movie theater, a relic from one of my grandma's stories brought to life. I sneak through the back door and see a 7:30 showing of Men in Black. The movie's shadowy government organization that oversees alien immigration is so much kinder and more beneficial than any organization from my time that I am moved to tears more than once. When Will Smith delivers the alien baby, when we see the alien immigrants navigating bureaucracy in MIB headquarters, when Tommy Lee Jones shakes the alien pug dog but lets him live? Or perhaps I am crying for my aborted life. Perhaps I'm crying because if I were a native of 1997, I'd have no time machine with which to kill myself, and I can't imagine living in this blessed decade and wanting to disappear for some other reason, for any reason. If I were a 1997 native, I'd not be forced to admit that, yes, I wanted to escape. Yes, I longed for a different world so acutely that it overrode my common sense. No accident, no hubris, just despair.
Well, that was depressing.
That's one of those stories that gives me goosebumps on the way out, you know?
On the way out.
At the end.
Yeah, it's just... Time travel stories aren't supposed to be sad and depressing and be like, well, things used to be better, now we're fucked.
Why not?
Why?
Isn't that... I think a lot of time travel stories are social commentary, especially we're going to see that in the next story.
I don't know, now I'm just depressed.
Well, that's okay. I think this story was very good. We immediately understood the mechanics of time travel, the side effect of time travel.
Yeah, the impermanence of time travel is a fun mechanic. I like that. It's kind of a one-way trip, but not really. Because when you come back, you're
over.
a shell of who you were.
Right.
Which kind of preserves the timeline a little, just a little.
I enjoy also, in some ways, I feel like that is similar to The Fly,
The Fly?
the movie The Fly from the 80s.
Yeah, why?
Well, first of all, it's like this machine that you're going through, which obviously a time machine, but also it's Jeff Goldblum is transported into this, he's probably more cognizant than these characters would be, but this different version of himself, this like version that will never be back, will never be as human as he was before.
Yeah.
It's like that. This known, we see it in Jeff Goldblum before he does, but like this known slow demise towards something terrible, like this acceptance of letting go of who you were.
What? I'm trying to remember which. Oh, it was Michael Crichton's Timeline. I think that was the name. So I read the book, but it was also a bad movie. In that you had a very limited number of times that you could safely time travel, because it sort of worked like I'm really just trying to pull from the dregs of my memory. I think it worked kind of like teleportation, in that your body was like deconstructed and reconstructed.
Sure.
And in doing so, there were slight imperfections. And so it's, which makes sense where, you're fully reconstructing molecules, right? And if capillaries get misaligned by a fraction of a millimeter, you can stroke out and die.
Wow.
So,
Sure.
like time travel was a very risky thing. I think this is what this came from.
Email us at filmsaboutLunatics@gmail.com and tell us how wrong Alan is about this.
Oh boy. But speaking of time travel rules, I did like Kaio's mythos of it doesn't travel through space, just time.
Right.
Which you see in a number of different time travel stories or mythos or whatnot. I think the most prevalent being Terminator, because they're just standing there and they just time travel, and then like the sphere just like melds right into the past. But
I'll say this: we did get some shit for leaving out, which I expected, certain time travel movies from last episode, and one of them people thought we didn't spend enough time on Terminator. So I'm glad you're bringing it up again now.
That was by design, because we are going to have a deep dive into Terminator once we do Killer AIs.
When are we doing Killer AIs?
That's an upcoming surprise topic.
I see.
But one thing that always makes me chuckle about any time this takes place, where it's like, okay, well, we can't move through space, just time. It's like, okay, well, one thing that we're failing to consider is that the Earth is constantly flying through space. And if you are trying to be in an exact location at a different time, if you travel from the future, the Earth is going to be, millions or billions of miles away from where it was at a certain place in time. It's never in the same. The universe is constantly expanding. It's never in the same space twice. So if you were to travel back in time from the future, you would just pop into outer space.
That's really cool.
Yeah, it's the whole idea behind Spaceship Earth. You're on this ball that's hurtling through space.
I thought that was like, and I haven't encountered that enough in time travel movies or books that I read, but that idea of it always brought you back to the same exact location, I thought that was really cool and unique. Again, like the idea of going back and seeing, to your point, you just kind of blew my mind. Like if you go back far enough, you're just in space. Like that's like,
you could go
crazy.
back an hour and you'd be in outer space. Less than. I mean, depends. Either, an hour and you are drastically in outer space, or I don't know, maybe you're in the center of the planet.
Now you're really sort of like challenging my understanding of space and time. I'm having a little bit of a mind meld.
Mind meld?
Because it's like, what is longitude then? What is latitude?
Right. So, I mean, that's
like Earth-centric, though. So in the way Kaio's story is written, it's giving you the plots of the Earth, not the plots of the universe. You
right.
know what I mean?
It's using Earth as the fixed location,
right,
as opposed to a fixed place in space,
in
right?
infinite space. Yeah.
Which, makes sense, I guess. It's all science fiction,
right?
But yeah, I guess you're locking, you're locking onto the Earth's magnetic poles, I suppose, which also would be like slightly changing over time. I mean, between 2077, that was the year, right? In 1997, like I imagine there's not going to be a huge swing, except for climate change. Who knows? Maybe that's changing the poles.
Right.
I don't know. I'm no climate scientist.
That's true.
Got to ask Trump for that.
You're not. Yeah. Don't. Well, thank you again to Kaio and Phil. Phil is an incredible voice actor, as you heard, but also a master of voices. And I'm personally challenging myself.
Yeah, you gave him a story without
I know. For the next time, I really hope that for the next topic, I want to, if no one submits one that kind of has voices, because I think the topic is perfect for voices, I'm going to write one for him because I want to show the world Phil's mastery of strange and unique voices.
Big Daddy Phil, or Big D Phil, as most people call him, has so many fun characters. So I really hope you write something for him.
We watched him, or you weren't there. I watched him read an entire children's book to children in
children
in an unbelievably accurate Elmo's voice last weekend. Like, it's just like, he's the best. He's great. So no pressure, Phil. But hopefully next time we'll get some range. Okay. I also want to talk briefly about Kaio because, again, like I said, Kaio's an incredible writer.
This, again, we just like, we're talking about this so much because, like, I'm so jazzed about that story. That was cool.
Yeah. And so if you want more from Kaio, which you all should, he has a blog, Second Adolescence, which is kaiomajor.substack.com. Of course, I will link it. And this is where Kaio writes about gender, mental illness, and pop culture. And his Twitter handle is Kaio_C_major. Again, I'll link everything. Excellent follow on Twitter. Excellent writer. Thank you all around to everybody. Okay, so I want to set up, Alan, what is going to happen next in this episode. We have 2 more stories.
Okay.
There's one more amazing modern story that was submitted for this show, which we are going to play at the end because it's a little bit darker and heavier. And we'll talk about why when we get there. But that way, if anyone wants to opt out, they can easily opt out.
Is it the time machine?
In the meantime, we are going to play you an excerpt from The Time Machine, which we talked about at length in the last episode. And of course, we teased out that our friend Jon C Cook of the Fado podcast has already done a reading of the story in its entirety. It's this novel on his show. So he very graciously, as he often does, lended us this excerpt so that we could bring you all into the world of H.G. Wells's The Time Machine. Just a reminder for anybody who's forgotten some of the fine print about this story, this is actually H.G. Wells's first novel. It's from 1895, and it's really famous for being the story that coined the term time machine. We're just going to play the first chapter. Highly recommend that you head over to the Fado podcast to listen to John read this novel in its entirety. It really gets into some interesting exploration of society, social commentary. We talked about it a bit last week, but without further ado, roll the tape.
The Time Machine. Written by H.G. Wells. Read by Jon C. Cook.
The time traveler, for so it will be convenient to speak of him, was expounding a recondite matter to us. His pale gray eyes shone and twinkled, and his usually pale face was flushed and animated. The fire burnt brightly, and the soft radiance of the incandescent lights in the lilies of silver caught the bubbles that flashed and passed in our glasses. Our chairs, being his patents, embraced and caressed us rather than submitted to be sat upon, and there was that luxurious after-dinner atmosphere when thought runs gracefully free of the trammels of precision. And he put it to us in this way, marking the points with a lean forefinger as we sat and lazily admired his earnestness over this new paradox, as we thought it, in his fecundity. "You must follow me carefully. I shall have to controvert 1 or 2 ideas that are almost universally accepted. The geometry, for instance, they taught you at school, is founded on a misconception." "Is not that a rather large thing to expect us to begin upon?" said Philby, an argumentative person with red hair. "I do not mean to ask you to accept anything without reasonable ground for it. You will soon admit as much as I need from you. You know, of course, that a mathematical line, a line of thickness nil, has no real existence. They taught you that. Neither has a mathematical plane. These things are mere abstractions." "That is all right," said the psychologist. Nor, having only length, breadth, and thickness, can a cube have a real existence. There I object, said Philby. Of course, a solid body may exist. All real things, so most people think. But wait a moment. Can an instantaneous cube exist? Don't follow you, said Philby. Can a cube that does not last for any time at all have a real existence? Philby became pensive. Clearly, the time traveler proceeded, any real body must have extension in 4 directions. It must have length, breadth, thickness, and duration. But through a natural infirmity of the flesh, which I will explain to you in a moment, we incline to overlook this fact. There are really 4 dimensions, 3 which we call the 3 planes of space, and a 4th, time. There is, however, a tendency to draw an unreal distinction between the former 3 dimensions and the latter, because it happens that our consciousness moves intermittently in one direction along the latter from the beginning to the end of our lives. That, said a very young man, making spasmodic efforts to relight his cigar over the lamp, that, very clear indeed. Now, it is very remarkable that this is so extensively overlooked, continued the time traveler, with a slight accession of cheerfulness. Really, this is what is meant by the 4th dimension, though some people who talk about the 4th dimension do not know they mean it. It is only another way of looking at time. There is no difference between time and any of the 3 dimensions of space, except that our consciousness moves along it. But some foolish people have got hold of the wrong side of that idea. You have all heard what they have to say about this 4th dimension. I have not, said the provincial mayor. It is simply this, that space, as our mathematicians have it, is spoken of as having 3 dimensions, which one may call length, breadth, and thickness, and is always definable by reference to 3 planes, each at right angles to the others. But some philosophical people have been asking why 3 dimensions particularly, why not another direction at right angles to the other 3, and have even tried to construct a 4-dimensional geometry. Professor Simon Newcomb was expounding this to the New York Mathematical Society only a month or so ago. You know how on a flat surface, which has only 2 dimensions, we can represent a figure of a 3-dimensional solid. And similarly, they think that by models of 3 dimensions they could represent one of 4, if they could master the perspective of the thing. See? I think so, murmured the provincial mayor, and knitting his brows he lapsed into an introspective state, his lips moving as one who repeats mystic words. Yes, I think I see it now, he said after some time, brightening in a quite transitory manner. Well, I do not mind telling you that I have been at work upon this geometry of 4 dimensions for some time. Some of my results are curious. For instance, here is a portrait of a man at 8 years old, another at 15, another at 17, another at 23, and so on. All these are evidently sections, as it were, 3-dimensional representations of his 4-dimensioned being, which is a fixed and unalterable thing. Scientific people, proceeded the time traveler after the pause required for the proper assimilation of this, know very well that time is only a kind of space. Here is a popular scientific diagram, a weather record. This line I trace with my finger shows the movement of the barometer. Yesterday it was so high, yesterday night it fell, then this morning it rose again, and so gently upward to here. Surely the mercury did not trace this line in any of the dimensions of space generally recognized, but certainly it traced such a line, and that line, therefore, we must conclude, was along the time dimension. But, said the medical man, staring hard at a coal in the fire, if time is really only a 4th dimension of space, why is it, and why has it always been, regarded as something different? And why cannot we move in time as we move about in the other dimensions of space? The time traveler smiled. Are you so sure we can move freely in space? Right and left we can go, backward and forward freely enough, and men always have done so. I admit we move freely in 2 dimensions. But how about up and down? Gravitation limits us there. Not exactly, said the medical man. There are balloons. But before the balloons, save for spasmodic jumping and the inequalities of the surface, man had no freedom of vertical movement. Still, they could move a little up and down, said the medical man. Easier, far easier down than up, And you cannot move at all in time. You cannot get away from the present moment. My dear sir, that is just where you are wrong. That is just where the whole world has gone wrong. We are always getting away from the present moment. Our mental existences, which are immaterial and have no dimensions, are passing along the time dimension with a uniform velocity from the cradle to the grave, just as we should travel down if we began our existence 50 miles above the Earth's surface. But the great difficulty is this, interrupted the psychologist. You can move about in all directions of space, but you cannot move about in time. That is the germ of my great discovery. But you're wrong to say that we cannot move about in time. For instance, if I am recalling an incident very vividly, I go back to the instant of its occurrence. I become absent-minded, as you say. I jump back for a moment. Of course, we have no means of staying back for any length of time, any more than a savage or an animal has of staying 6 feet above the ground. But a civilized man is better off than the savage in this respect. He can go up against gravitation in a balloon, and why should he not hope that ultimately he may be able to stop or accelerate his drift along the time dimension, or even turn about and travel the other way? "Oh, this," began Philby, "is all—" "Why not?" said the time traveler. "It's against reason," said Philby. "What reason?" said the time traveler. "You can show black is white by argument," said Philby, "but you will never convince me." "Possibly not," said the time traveler, "but now you begin to see the object of my investigations into the geometry of 4 dimensions. Long ago I had a vague inkling of a machine to travel through time," exclaimed the very young man, "that shall travel indifferently in any direction of space and time as the driver determines." Philby contented himself with laughter. "But I have experimental verification," said the time traveler. "It would be remarkably convenient for the historian," the psychologist suggested. "One might travel back and verify the accepted account of the Battle of Hastings, for instance." "Don't you think you would attract attention?" said the medical man. "Our ancestors had no great tolerance for anachronisms. One might get one's Greek from the very lips of Homer and Plato," the very young man thought. "In which case they would certainly plough you for the little go. The German scholars have improved Greek so much." "Then there is the future," said the very young man. "Just think, one might invest all one's money, leave it to accumulate at interest, and hurry on ahead." "To discover a society," said I, "erected on a strictly communistic basis." "Of all the wild, extravagant theories," began the psychologist. "Yes, and so it seemed to me, and so I never talked of it until—" "Experimental verification," cried I. "You are going to verify that?" "The experiment," cried Philby, who was getting brain-weary. "Let's see your experiment anyhow," said the psychologist, "though it's all humbug, you know." The time traveler smiled round at us. Then, still smiling faintly, and with his hands deep in his trousers pocket, he walked slowly out of the room, and we heard his slippers shuffling down the long passage to his laboratory. The psychologist looked at us. "I wonder what he's got." "Some sleight-of-hand trick or other," said the medical man, and Philby tried to tell us about a conjurer he had seen at Burslem, but before he had finished his preface the time traveler came back, and Philby's anecdote collapsed. The thing the time traveler held in his hand was a glittering metallic framework, scarcely larger than a small clock, and very delicately made. There was ivory in it and some transparent crystalline substance. And now I must be explicit, for this that follows, unless his explanation is to be accepted, is an absolutely unaccountable thing. He took one of the small octagonal tables that were scattered about the room and set it in front of the fire, with 2 legs on the hearth-rug, and on this table he placed the mechanism. Then he drew up a chair and sat down. The only other object on the table was a small shaded lamp, the bright light of which fell upon the model. There were also perhaps a dozen candles about, 2 in brass candlesticks upon the mantel and several in sconces, so that the room was brilliantly illuminated. I sat in a low armchair nearest the fire, and I drew this forward so as to be almost between the time traveler and the fireplace. Philby sat behind him looking over his shoulder. The medical man and the provincial mayor watched him in profile from the right, the psychologist from the left. The very young man stood behind the psychologist. We were all on the alert. It appears incredible to me that any kind of trick, however subtly conceived and however adroitly done, could have been played upon us under these conditions. The time traveler looked at us and then at the mechanism. "Well," said the psychologist. "This little affair," said the time traveler, resting his elbows upon the table and pressing his hands together above the apparatus, "is only a model. It is my plan for a machine to travel through time. You will notice that it looks singularly askew, and that there is an odd twinkling appearance about this bar, as though it was in some way unreal." He pointed to the part with his finger. "Also, here is one little white lever, and here is another." The medical man got up out of his chair and peered into the thing. "It's beautifully made," he said. "It took 2 years to make," retorted the time traveler. Then, when we had all imitated the action of the medical man, he said, "Now I want you clearly to understand that this lever being pressed over sends the machine gliding into the future, and this other reverses the motion. This saddle represents the seat of a time traveler. Presently, I'm going to press the lever, and off the machine will go. It will vanish, pass into future time, and disappear. Have a good look at the thing. Look at the table, too, and satisfy yourselves there is no trickery. I don't want to waste this model and then be told I'm a quack." There was a minute's pause, perhaps. The psychologist seemed about to speak to me, but changed his mind. Then the time traveler put forth his finger towards the lever. "No," he said suddenly, "lend me your hand." And turning to the psychologist, he took that individual's hand in his own and told him to put out his forefinger, so that it was the psychologist himself who sent forth the model time machine on its interminable voyage. We all saw the lever turn. I am absolutely certain there was no trickery. There was a breath of wind, and the lamp flame jumped. One of the candles on the mantel was blown out, and the little machine suddenly swung round, became indistinct, was seen as a ghost for a second, perhaps, as an eddy of faintly glittering brass and ivory, and it was gone. Vanished. Save for the lamp, the table was bare. Everyone was silent for a minute. Then Philby said he was damned. The psychologist recovered from his stupor and suddenly looked under the table. At that, the time traveler laughed cheerfully. "Well," he said, with a reminiscence of the psychologist. Then, getting up, he went to the tobacco jar on the mantel, and with his back to us began to fill his pipe. We stared at each other. "Look here," said the medical man. "Are you in earnest about this? Do you seriously believe that time machine has traveled into time?" "Certainly," said the time traveler, stooping to light a spill at the fire. Then he turned, lighting his pipe, to look at the psychologist's face. The psychologist, to show that he was not unhinged, helped himself to a cigar and tried to light it uncut. "What is more, I have a big machine nearly finished in there." He indicated the laboratory. "And when that is put together, I mean to have a journey on my own account." "You mean to say that that machine has traveled into the future?" said Philby. "Into the future or the past. I don't for certain know which." After an interval, the psychologist had an inspiration. "It must have gone into the past if it has gone anywhere," he said. "Why?" said the time traveler. "Because I presume that it has not moved in space, and if it traveled into the future it would still be here all this time, since it must have traveled through this time." "But," said I, "if it traveled into the past, it would have been visible when we first came into this room, and last Thursday when we were here, and the Thursday before that, and so forth." "Serious objections," remarked the provincial mayor with an air of impartiality, turning toward the time traveler. "Not a bit," said the time traveler, and to the psychologist, "You think you can explain that? It's presentation below the threshold, you know. Diluted presentation." "Of course," said the psychologist, and reassured us. "That's a simple point of psychology. I should have thought of it. It's plain enough, and helps the paradox delightfully. We cannot see, nor can we appreciate this machine any more than we can the spoke of a wheel spinning, or a bullet flying through the air. If it is traveling through time 50 times or 100 times faster than we are, if it gets through a minute while we get through a second, the impression it creates will of course be only 1/50th or 1/100th of what it would make if it were not traveling in time. That's plain enough." He passed his hand through the space in which the machine had been. "You see?" he said, laughing. We sat and stared at the vacant table for a minute or so. Then the time traveler asked us what we thought of it all. "That sounds plausible enough tonight," said the medical man, "but wait until tomorrow. Wait for the common sense of the morning." "Would you like to see the time machine itself?" asked the time traveler, and therewith, taking the lamp in his hand, he led the way down the long, drafty corridor to his laboratory. I remember vividly the flickering light, his queer, broad head and silhouette, the dance of the shadows, how we all followed him, puzzled but incredulous, and how there in the laboratory we beheld a larger edition of the little mechanism which we had seen vanish from before our eyes. Parts were of nickel, parts of ivory. Parts had certainly been filed or sawn out of rock crystal. The thing was generally complete, but the twisted crystalline bars lay unfinished upon the bench beside some sheets of drawings, and I took one up for a better look at it. Quartz it seemed to be. "Look here," said the medical man. "Are you perfectly serious, or is this a trick, like that ghost you showed us last Christmas?" "Upon that machine," said the time traveler, holding the lamp aloft, "I intend to explore time. Is that plain? I was never more serious in my life." None of us quite knew how to take it. I caught Philby's eye over the shoulder of the medical man, and he winked at me solemnly.
I'm not sure if we listened to the first chapter or the first two.
That was the first 2 chapters. It was just so intriguing. I thought, let's just let it play, you know? I was very intrigued by the mechanics of the time machine itself, the testing that they were doing, like how the switches work. Because again, the story is from the late 1800s, which to me, it's like this added layer of, okay, sure, science fiction, you know, in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, like we have such a clear sense of what that is. This is from the 1800s. H.G. Wells was like the person who really is given a lot of credit for almost creating this genre, you know? So it's cool to kind of trace this back almost as far as it can go in terms of literature, obviously, not in terms of generality.
It really is interesting. The discussion of like time being the 4th dimension. I don't know when did that all start? You imagine it being, the whole extra dimensional physics and everything coming, I don't know, 1900s at least. You think like Einstein and stuff, but I guess this is all predated significantly. I doubt H.G. Wells made that up.
Yeah, that's something worth looking into at some point for sure. But again, still, it feels right, like a lot more modern than it is.
For sure. Like this is 1800s, like not that long before this. Our country had slavery, and in this time period, women can't even wear pants. And yet here we're talking about science-based time machines.
It's wild, yeah. To me, that was the most fun aspect, was not having read the entire novel yet, but the mechanics of the time machine and how it fits in.
Did you ever see the Time Machine movie?
No,
like
have
2006 or something like that?
No.
I remember watching it. I don't remember anything about it. So I remember it, so it's probably not that good.
I think that's what I've heard. That's probably why we didn't watch it for the last episode.
But I do remember watching it. I remember being excited about it, but I can't even tell you what the plot of this movie is.
Wasn't there a movie that you watched after we recorded last episode that we wanted to talk about?
I watched so many time travel movies, even after we recorded that episode. I think my favorite of these was Time Lapse. It's like a cast of like 3, but Danielle Pennebaker is the only one that I recognize because she's from The Flash.
Oh, nice.
Which was funny seeing her not be in literally anything except The Flash. But that movie, what a sleeping hit. Such a great, great movie. I don't want to say a thing about it. Just go watch it. Go in blind, which is my preferred way to watch most good movies, especially time travel movies. Just go in blind, don't know a thing about it, and it's going to be amazing.
Yeah, I enjoy that too. Okay, so we have one more story, but since you have watched so many time travel movies for this series, what is the best version of a time machine for your preference, your personal preference?
Best version of a time machine?
Like what movie are you like, that time machine is it? That wins best time machine.
I'm thinking.
I'm only asking this, obviously, because of the fact that we just heard an excerpt from The Time Machine.
I'm going to say that my favorite time machine, which makes the most sense, is probably the one from Terminator.
Okay.
Simply because it's a one-way trip. Like, there's no machine that travels with you. You can't even bring things with you. It's just, which is actually interesting that I'm thinking about it. In Terminator, when you time travel, you can't even bring your clothes with you. Like, just a giant sphere of energy shows up. It burns everything in the sphere, and then the only thing left in the sphere is you.
I guess I've never seen Terminator.
What the fuck, really?
Yeah, I have no memory of anything about this.
You're awful.
See the abuse that I have to live with every day?
We're done. We're done here.
On the podcast or our relationship?
Both. Terminator's great.
Okay, well,
Terminator 2 Judgment Day Director's Cut is one of the greatest movies ever made.
top 5?
Top one.
Okay. All right, so Terminator is your favorite time machine.
So because it really cements a lot of rules for time travel
Sure.
that kind of get around time travel fuckery.
Okay.
Like in H.G. Wells's time. Okay, let's talk about the DeLorean, right?
Okay, yeah.
The DeLorean,
Back to the Future.
you can just pop it in, go 5 minutes back. Oh, let me just try that again. 10 minutes back. You know?
Big.
And like, yeah, okay, so now you're introducing a whole bunch of paradoxes.
Sure.
In Terminator, it's a one-way trip. You can bring nothing with you except your memories.
Poetic.
You can't even go back to the future, if you will.
Right.
You don't even know if what you did worked, which is one of the reasons. Well, it's like one of the staples of the series because like they don't know if it works. That's why they just keep sending people back because like shit's not changing because fixed timeline.
Right.
But this fixed timeline, layers on layers. I can't get into Terminator right now.
Okay.
But yeah, that's my favorite time machine.
I'm going to say one final thing before we hop to the last story here, which is I think we missed an important Stephen King novel called 11/22/63. It's a date. I only believe that because I have a very close friend who is a super fan of time travel media.
Who's this?
Our friend Rhett from LA.
Rhett from LA.
And apparently we missed a key Stephen King time travel story. And I'm assuming that it's this. So apologies to all the Stephen King fans out there, and just wanted to make sure everyone had a new recommendation. All right. This last story we've been sequestering to the end of this episode because it's a little bit heavy. This is an incredibly talented writer who we have featured on the podcast before. I'm going to give a content warning on this story for suicidal ideation and alluding to sexual assault. We'll talk more about it after, but in the meantime, roll the tape.
Once Upon a Time, written by Nadira Jamerson, read by Sam Owens.
I had already tried hypnosis, meditation, and something called recovered memory therapy, where you pay a smooth-talking woman with soft eyes $300 to talk you through various imagery and teach you how to journal in a way that's supposed to unbury your subconscious. 3 years of trying to remember and nothing worked. All I was left with were those same flashes of pink-walled rooms that felt too close, and sitting on a dryer while tears pricked my eyes, and a never-ending sensation of something buzzing, crawling beneath my skin. If the flashes could even be believed, I was 5 or 7 or maybe only 4. My father was in every one. His face was smiling at me as I sat on the dryer, telling me, "You know you can cry in front of me." Maybe his hand was on my thigh, or he was sitting just to the side of me in my childhood bedroom. Maybe his hand was on my back. 3 years later, 3 years since I moved away from home, I was desperate and probably somewhat suicidal. Imagine thinking the worst possible thing about one of the people you're meant to love the most, except you have no proof, because you are too young to be sure, or because memories can be deceiving, you tell yourself. So you can't believe it. Yet you still feel it. Something deep, deep down telling you things are not okay. Telling you I was desperate and I was beginning to hate myself. That's why I did it. One night, after I had fallen asleep on the couch in my first roommateless apartment, I awoke to the sound of aggressive chewing coming from my TV screen. My eyes opened to the scene of a man sitting on the floor of a blood-spattered kitchen, His mouth was covered in the same blood, and a naked woman lay on the counter just above him, dead. There were bits of flesh missing from her torso, and one chunk had been taken out of her face. I realized he was eating her, chewing longer than necessary, with a mixed look of pain and euphoria on his face. As the movie progressed, I learned he was a prolific serial killer who believed he could consume the essence and memories, the life force, he called it, of people he killed and ate. After he was caught by the police, they interviewed him about his victims, and he was able to recall all of these things about them only close friends and family should have known. He could describe perfectly the face of a man one of his victims had lost her virginity to. He knew another one of his victims was gay, even though she had only come out to her best friend because her family was extremely religious. He claimed another of his victims had been abused by her uncle growing up. Although the uncle was interviewed and seemed cagey, police said, this was unverified because the woman had never come forward with allegations while she was still alive. After the movie was over, I looked up the title, Little Bites, and discovered it was actually based on true events about a serial killer who had been caught in Germany a few years ago. There were lots of conspiracy theories surrounding him, and I fell into a deep dive that night. Some people claimed he had simply stalked his victims extensively and learned things even their families were unaware of, except one of the women he killed, the one who was gay, was a tourist. She had only been in town 2 days before he saw her at a bar, followed her to her car, knocked her over the head, and dragged her body into his vehicle that was sitting just beside her. There was no way he would have had time to learn that about her. Other people said, while they didn't agree with his methods, that the killer was telling the truth about his ritual. One user said some cultures believed the same, that a life could be stored in the flesh of a person even if their soul had ascended to another plane. The body keeps the score, read the Reddit message board. For 2 weeks after seeing the movie, I read up on the practice and became, honestly, obsessed with it. There was something about its vulgarity and intimacy that totally intrigued me. I started to think maybe, and that was all it took. I made a plan. I needed to know. I had tried everything else. I wouldn't be hurting anyone but myself, and I was already hurting so deeply, so I could not care about that. I bought 4 plastic table covers from Target to cover my kitchen and took the day off from work. I got drunk so the slicing wouldn't hurt so much. I had a bandage on standby. I tried not to cut too deep. It hurt, but in a sweet way, like letting something heavy out. The crawling sensation subsided as I drank and sliced. Even before I bit into myself, the experience felt freeing. I hesitated for a moment before eating. Looking at the brown and red on my plate, I thought, this is disgusting. I should be disgusted with myself. The shame still couldn't stop me. I used my fork. I stabbed into the unevenly cut strips and started to chew. I tasted salty and familiar, and maybe it was the alcohol, maybe it was the blood spilling out from the bandage I hadn't tied tightly enough, but as soon as I bit into myself, everything in the room started to spin. Everything in my head started to spin. I saw one scene after the other, like traveling through time. I was in the past and back and seeing the future as quickly as breath switched from one to the next in my chest. I saw everything I was, everything that had been done to me, and everything I could be if I didn't let myself bleed out in the kitchen.
While not explicitly time travel, that's a pretty cool story.
I disagree. I think it's time travel through trauma, and it's mental time travel.
I actually learned about this fairly recently while I was working on a psychology lecture. The difference between, I forget what the term for like a normal memory is, but there's a traumatic memory and there's a term for normal memory that I can't remember what it is. But a social memory maybe, but whatever it is.
Yeah.
Those memories change and adapt through the years, right? Because as you remember them, you're just remembering a copy of the last time you remember it. That's why memory fades.
Whoa.
That's why memory changes. It's like you're making a copy of a copy and things just change a little bit. That's why, favorite memories alter over time, you know? Just like slight details are hard to recount. Whereas sometimes when, you know, a memory from many, many years ago that you haven't thought of like since you were a kid, when it pops in, all these like details are so vivid and fresh because you haven't remembered it before. It hasn't been through the copy machine.
Sure.
However, a traumatic memory doesn't change. It's the same every single time. Now, granted, this is me paraphrasing a psychology lecture that went way over my head, but this was my takeaway.
Yeah.
You can't recall it by will, like a normal memory.
Sure.
It just comes intrusively.
Yeah.
Oftentimes completely unbidden, and it's the same every single time, with very few deviations.
Yeah.
Which I don't know. I just found that to be very interesting, especially because, like, you know, this story was about going back to the past via traumatic memories.
Yep.
And like, I guess that tracks, because if it's so vivid, nothing changes. Like, yeah, you remember those things.
Yeah, absolutely. I thought the story was beautiful. And again, not to your point, like not science fiction time travel with a time machine in the same way a lot of the other stories and movies are that we've talked about in this series, but I think a really fresh and interesting take on time travel, especially with this idea of, like, a lot of movies, right? A lot of the classic time travel movies are about going to the past to fix something for the future. And that's kind of what this is still, right? Like, it's this idea of needing to move through the past and understand it to heal from it and move forward. So I actually think, despite it being a little bit more abstract, perhaps, that the timeline is still really reminiscent of, you know, the plot line is still really reminiscent of what we get in classic time travel, but obviously with this more loaded and meaningful outcome.
The only thing that I would really like to note about this is that clearly this mythos was pulled from one of the greatest existing works of fiction in existence, besides Terminator. And that is the Underworld series.
How?
Wait, how? What do you mean how? The blood memories are a staple of the vampire community. So when you have Kate Beckinsale's character go through all these shenanigans about trying to prove this crazy vampire conspiracy, Victor, played by the incredible Bill Nye, isn't going to believe her because, you know, she's like some real heavy conspiracy shit, right? That like breaks all vampire laws. But if you drink someone's blood, you get their memories.
That's cool.
It's incredibly cool. The only way, and you can't fake it, right?
Sure.
It's just like literally like a force pull of memories. The way that she's able to convince stubborn Bill Nye about like that this conspiracy is actually happening and he needs to deal with it is to present her blood memories. So like he goes into her past, you know?
Yeah.
So like when Bill Nye's character is revived, because like he's like a little dried up husk because like the vampires sleep. He's revived with Kate Beckinsale's blood, which is like super taboo. It's like a big ritual, and she just like fucked it all up. So like her memories were all kind of like cloudy and foggy, and she's like, "But you saw them, right?" He's like, "I saw flashes," and so he's all confused, and so they have to get to the bottom of this, and he's like all stubborn, right? But there's just that really cool mechanic of memories being tied to the flesh. And you see that in a few different things. Like you see that in Underworld, and also thinking of the game Prototype, which is the coolest fucking game. You basically can just like, you eat people by like, you have like tentacles and shit, and you can just like absorb their biomass into you, which 100% kills them. But then you get all of their memories and you can turn into them. You have literally all of their information, including their DNA. So like you can morph into that person with all of their memories. You can literally become that person.
That's super cool. That's I like that. We should explore that more at some point.
You can also turn your hands into giant knives.
And they do say the body keeps a score. That's a real thing. That's a lot of like the theories of real psychologists and doctors that you carry trauma with you physically.
Oh, for sure. If you get like your legs blown off.
I even mean more subtly than that.
Oh.
Yeah. Thank you so much to Nadira for the story. It was beautiful and haunting. You can follow Nadira on Instagram at NadiraXRenee, and her website is nadirxrenee.com. Of course, we will link everything in the description of this. That concludes our time travel series. Thank you all so much for listening. Thank you for submitting stories. You can always reach out to us at filmsaboutlunatics@gmail.com if you want to submit stories, if you want to get on our writer's mailing list so you know upcoming topics, if you have real paranormal experiences that you want to be featured on the podcast, please reach out.
Or just join the Discord to talk about Terminator.
Yes, please join our Discord. It's always linked in the description of the podcast.
And you can ignore Frodo Baggins. He's out of control. Just turn him off. That's what I did.
You can indeed mute certain channels if you would prefer to. That's totally fine. I won't take it personally.
You really should. He's a monster.
I want to give a little bit of a spoiler for next week. Please, everybody go and start listening to the Chilling podcast. It's a very scary and great podcast by our friend Lindsay Brisbine. I will be talking to her on the next episode, so it'd be awesome if you all kind of came into it knowing the background of what we're talking about. But even if you don't, it's still a great episode. I'm super excited to share that with you all. But as always, thank you so much for being here. Stay spooky and stay safe, and we will talk to you very soon.
Okay, bye.
Bye. Thanks for listening. If you'd like some bonus content, consider supporting us on Patreon to access our patron-exclusive podcast, Horror Movie Club.
Also, head to lunaticsproject.com to check out our spooky merch and apparel.
You can find us at Lunatics Project on Twitter and TikTok, and The Lunatics Project on Instagram and YouTube, where you'll find our short horror films, cemetery tours, and so much more.
And please rate and review. A little feedback goes a long way to help us grow and get more content out there.
Our cover art is by Pilar Kep, and musical bumpers are by Michaela Papa and Jordan Moser.